They stole my family's island. For an entire year, I was forced to watch in silence as the HOA trespassed, clear-cut ancient trees, and built 32 luxury cabins on our most sacred land. My lawyers told me to sue immediately, but I refused. I had a different plan. I let them invest every single dollar, let them believe they had won, while I quietly assembled a legal weapon they never saw coming. I didn't just want my land back. I was going to make them pay for it with their own money. My grandfather bought the 7-acre island in Crystal Lake back in 1948, when it was just a wild, overgrown piece of rock and earth. He saw its potential not for money, but for peace. For my brother and me, the island wasn't just a place. It was the backdrop of our childhood. We learned to swim in its coves, built forts in its pine forests, and spent every summer sleeping under its stars. It was our kingdom. When my grandfather passed, he left the island to me with a single handwritten line in his will: "Protect our sanctuary." The deed was ironclad, or so I thought. It clearly outlined the property lines, placing the entire island down to the waterline in my name. I had it framed. My wife, Anna, and our young son, Leo, lived in a house on the mainland shore, part of the Crystal Shores community. The HOA, led by a man named David Corbin, was initially just a minor nuisance. They'd send letters about grass length or mailbox colors. Corbin was a retired property developer, a man who wore polo shirts emblazoned with the community logo and spoke of maximizing potential. He'd often look across the water at my island and make comments. "A shame to let all that prime real estate just sit there," he'd say with a tight smile. "Think of the view lots we could create." I'd always laugh it off. "It's not for creating lots, David. It's for creating memories." But I underestimated his ambition. The first sign of real trouble was a proposed amendment to the HOA covenants sent to all residents. Buried in dense legal jargon on page 17 was a single terrifying clause. It claimed that undeveloped land masses within the community's water body, regardless of private deed, fall under the association's purview for aesthetic and developmental harmony. My blood ran cold. They weren't just making suggestions anymore. They were writing a rule to steal my kingdom, and the vote was just 1 month away. I fought the amendment with everything I had. I went door to door, explaining to my neighbors that this was a dangerous overreach, that if the HOA could steal my private island, no one's property was safe. But David Corbin was a master manipulator. He hosted barbecues and pool parties, painting a vivid picture of a new, exclusive lakeside resort on the island, a resort that would, he promised, significantly raise all of their property values. He called my family selfish for hoarding the island. He sold them a dream, and my deed was the only thing standing in its way. The amendment passed by 3 votes. The very next week, surveyors arrived on my island without my permission. When I raced over in my boat and ordered them off, they calmly showed me a document signed by the HOA board, authorizing a topographical survey for community planning purposes. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter. I was being forced to watch the invasion of my own land, powerless to stop it. The harassment then became personal. We started receiving massive unjustified fines. A $500 fine for an unapproved shed that was a small decorative birdhouse. A $1,000 fine for unsightly vegetation, because we'd let a patch of wildflowers grow in our backyard to help the bees. They fined us for our son's treehouse, calling it an unpermitted structure. Each envelope in the mailbox was a fresh punch to the gut, a deliberate campaign to drain our finances and our spirit. Anna and I started arguing, the constant stress fraying our nerves. Our home, once a haven, was now a source of constant anxiety. Then came the letter that changed everything. It was a formal notice of intent to develop, citing the newly passed amendment. The HOA, it stated, was exercising its right to enhance community assets and would be proceeding with the construction of up to 32 luxury cabins on the island. My island. I felt the world tilt. This wasn't just a fine or a petty rule. This was outright theft. I hired the best land rights lawyer I could afford. We sued immediately, filing an injunction to stop the construction. The courtroom battle was brutal. Corbin and the HOA had a team of slick attorneys who argued that the amendment was legally sound. that the island was a blight on the community's aesthetic, and that their development plan was for the greater good. The judge, an elderly man who seemed bored by the whole affair, ultimately ruled against us. He declared the amendment, while aggressive, was technically legal based on the HOA's governing documents. Our injunction was denied. The sound of chainsaws started the following Monday. From our kitchen window, we watched in horror as ancient pines that my grandfather had planted were felled. The sound was like screams. My son, Leo, would put his hands over his ears and cry. The feeling of helplessness was a physical pain, a constant suffocating weight on my chest. I had failed. I had failed my grandfather, my family, and the land I was sworn to protect. It was in the depths of that despair, sitting in my late grandfather's old study, that I found it. Tucked inside a journal was a brittle, yellowed piece of paper from 1947, a full year before he even bought the island. It was a signed affidavit from the original owner of the entire Crystal Shores land, a man named Silas Green. It stated that the island was to be considered a family heirloom parcel, forever separate from any future community associations, and that any attempt to levy fees or claim jurisdiction over it would be null and void. My grandfather had known. He had known people like Corbin would one day come, and he had left me a key. But this wasn't a key to stop them, not yet. My lawyer was cautiously optimistic but warned me. This is powerful, but it's old. We could fight this in appeals court for years. By the time we win, the island will be covered in cabins, and the HOA will be bankrupt from legal fees. A courtroom victory might be a hollow one. That's when the real plan, the dangerous, patient plan, began to form in my mind. I looked at the construction crews and at Corbin's smug face during HOA meetings, and I made a decision that terrified me. I stopped fighting. I publicly dropped our lawsuit. I told Corbin and the entire HOA, my voice shaking with feigned defeat, that they had won. I was tired of the fight, I said. I couldn't afford it anymore. The relief on their faces was a mask for their triumph. They saw a broken man. They didn't see the calculation behind my eyes. I let them build. For an entire year, I watched. I watched as they poured millions of the HOA's reserve funds and millions more from a special assessment levied on all homeowners into my island. I tracked every permit and every invoice made public in their meeting minutes. They built roads, installed power lines, and erected 32 beautiful luxury cabins, each one a monument to their greed. They named it Corbin's Landing. My wife thought I had given up. The distance between us grew. The silence in our house was deafening. But every night I was in that study, working with my lawyer, not to stop the construction, but to study it. We were building a different case, a case not just of ownership, but of devastating total reclamation. We weren't just going to prove the island was mine. We were going to make them pay for every single nail and every shingle and then hand it all over to me. The annual HOA budget meeting was always a packed, theatrical affair, but this year was different. This year, it was held in the new, sprawling Corbin's Landing pavilion on my island. The air was thick with the smell of fresh paint and new money. David Corbin stood at the podium, beaming, a projected image of the completed cabin resort glowing behind him. He was no longer just the HOA president. He was a visionary developer in his own mind, bathing in the applause of his constituents. I sat in the back row, anonymous and silent. Anna and Leo were at home. I couldn't bear for them to witness my final crushing humiliation if my plan failed. My lawyer sat beside me, a slim, black briefcase on his lap. Corbin's speech was a masterpiece of self-congratulation. "We faced opposition," he boomed, his voice echoing across the water. "We faced legal challenges from those who couldn't see the bigger picture. But we persevered. We have transformed a community eyesore into our crown jewel. And the best part?" He paused for dramatic effect. "The first-year rental projections for Corbin's Landing will not only cover the entire development cost, but will eliminate your HOA dues for the next 5 years." The room erupted in cheers. People were on their feet, applauding the man who had made their dreams of a free ride come true. They were celebrating the theft of my inheritance. My hands were clenched so tightly my nails dug half-moons into my palms. Then Corbin opened the floor for questions. For a few minutes, it was all softballs about rental schedules and pool access. Then my lawyer gave me a slight nod. I stood up. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to me. I could feel the mixture of pity and contempt in their gazes. The defeated man was rising from his ashes. Corbin's smile was condescending. "Ah, our island enthusiast. Don't worry. We've reserved a prime booking week for you and your family. A gesture of goodwill." A few people chuckled. I didn't smile. "I have a question about the budget, David. Specifically, the line item for Corbin's landing capital expenditure. It lists a total investment of $4.3 million from HOA reserves and special homeowner assessments. Is that correct?" Corbin's smile tightened. "That is correct. A sound investment, as my presentation just showed." "It's a very specific number," I continued, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. I was going through some of my grandfather's old papers recently. Found something fascinating, a document from 1947, signed by Silas Green, the original owner of all this land. I nodded to my lawyer, who stood and walked to the front, projecting a high-resolution scan of the brittle affidavit onto the massive screen next to Corbin's resort photo. The room was dead silent. "Would you read the highlighted section aloud for everyone, David?" I asked. Corbin, flustered, squinted at the screen. His face began to drain of color. "The herein described Heritage Island parcel shall remain in perpetuity separate from any and all future associations. Any and all improvements made upon said land by any entity other than the deed holder shall become the sole property of the deed holder. With all development costs deemed non-recoverable," he trailed off. The words "sole property of the deed holder" hung in the air. The room was still confused. Someone shouted, "What does that mean?" "It means," my lawyer said, his voice booming with legal authority, "that this document, a legally binding covenant that runs with the land, predates your HOA by decades. It means the amendment you passed was not just aggressive, it was illegal. And it means that by building these 32 cabins, the HOA has not created an asset for itself." He paused, looking directly at Corbin, whose jaw was slack with horror. "It has gifted a $4.3 million resort, fully constructed and permitted to my client." The silence shattered. The room exploded into shouts of disbelief and anger. "That can't be right! He's lying! Our money!" In the chaos, I walked to the front, standing beside the projected image of my grandfather's affidavit. I looked at Corbin, whose face was a mask of pure, undiluted panic. "You spent $4.3 million of their money," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the pavilion. "You bullied, and you schemed to build on my land. And you were so arrogant, you never once considered that my grandfather was smarter than you." I turned to the stunned, furious crowd. "You wanted to know where your money went? There it is." I pointed at the cabins behind me. "You didn't invest in a resort. You invested in my inheritance. Every shingle, every window, every dollar is now mine. And I intend to claim every single one of them." The room descended into total bedlam. People were screaming at Corbin, who had sunk into his chair, his head in his hands. The gavel fell uselessly. The dream of zero HOA dues had just evaporated into a financial nightmare, and they had just witnessed the man they'd mocked seize absolute victory from the jaws of their greed. I leaned down close to Corbin so only he could hear me over the din. "You called my island an eyesore. You called me selfish for protecting it." I stood up straight, looking down at the broken man. "But you were right about one thing, David. It is the community's crown jewel now, and I'm the king." The fallout was swift, absolute, and profoundly satisfying. In the days following the meeting, the community descended into a civil war, but their fury was no longer directed at me. It was laser-focused on David Corbin and the HOA board, the $4. $3 million they had collectively invested wasn't just gone. It had been transformed into my personal property. I was no longer the pariah. I was the creditor who held the deed to their failed investment. The legal process that followed was a formality. My grandfather's covenant was so ironclad, so explicitly clear, that the HOA's lawyers advised them to settle immediately. There would be no long, drawn-out appeal. They had no ground to stand on. The final settlement agreement was signed in a quiet, sterile conference room. David Corbin did not look at me once. The document stated that the HOA relinquished all claims to the island and, critically, acknowledged that all structures upon it were now my sole property, free and clear. They were also ordered to cover my legal fees. I didn't just get my island back. I was given a multi-million-dollar resort and paid for the privilege. The personal victory was even sweeter. The day after the settlement was finalized, I took Anna and Leo out to the island. We walked through the silent, empty cabins, beautifully constructed, fully furnished, and waiting for guests who would never come for the HOA. The weight that had crushed our family for 2 years finally lifted. Leo ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the pine trees once more, a sound I feared I'd never hear there again. Anna held my hand, her tears not of stress but of relief and joy. "You did it," she whispered. "You protected our sanctuary." We had our kingdom back, but it was now a fortress, its borders secured by the unassailable law my grandfather had put in place a lifetime ago. The consequences for the HOA were catastrophic. David Corbin was immediately recalled as president and, facing threats of lawsuits from his own former supporters, sold his home and moved out of the state within 3 months. He was utterly erased from the community he had sought to dominate. The entire board was replaced by a new, chastened group whose first act was to dissolve the controversial amendment and significantly roll back the HOA's power. The special assessment that had funded the cabins was a total loss for every homeowner. There were no refunds. The dream of zero dues had become a reality of massive, unrecoverable financial loss. The community's property values, which Corbin had promised to raise, initially plummeted due to the scandal and the HOA's now precarious financial state. But what did I do with 32 empty cabins? I had no desire to run a resort. That was Corbin's dream, not mine. So, I created a different kind of legacy. I donated 10 of the cabins to a charity that provides retreats for families of fallen soldiers and children with life-threatening illnesses. The rest I sold. The proceeds were more than enough to create a robust trust fund for Leo's future, ensure our family's financial security for generations, and set up a fund for the permanent conservation of the island, legally shielding it from any future predatory attempts. The long-term impact was a rebalancing of power, not just for me, but for the entire community. The new HOA operated with transparency and a renewed respect for private property rights. The petty tyranny was over. My relationship with my neighbors was complicated, a mix of resentment and grudging respect, but the fear was gone. We had all learned a brutal lesson about the cost of blind ambition and the power of quiet resolve. So what's the takeaway from all of this? It's not that all HOAs are evil. The takeaway is this. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a loud confrontation, but a patient, silent strategy. They counted on me to fight them head-on, to exhaust myself and my resources in a battle they had rigged. But by stepping back, by letting their own greed and arrogance blind them, I allowed them to build the very trap that would ultimately ensnare them. They operated on the principle that might makes right, that the loudest voice wins. But I operated on my grandfather's principle, that a legacy built on integrity is stronger than any structure built on greed. He didn't just leave me a piece of land. He left me a shield and the wisdom to know when to raise it. They stole my island to build their empire. So I let them build it, and when they were done, I simply changed the locks. Your peace, your home, your legacy. Is it worth fighting for? I know mine was. And as I watched the sunset paint the lake in fiery colors, my son skipping stones from the same shore my grandfather once fished from, I know, with absolute certainty, that every moment of that silent, patient fight was worth it.